The first time Anara stepped onto the plantation, the air itself seemed to pause. The workers who saw her swore later that the wind had fallen still, as if the land had drawn a single, careful breath. She was young, quiet, and beautiful in a way that felt out of place in a world built on cruelty. Her eyes, dark, steady, unblinking, carried a kind of knowing that made even the bravest men look away. The master watched her too long the day she arrived. The mistress watched him watching her. Nights on the estate had always been heavy, wrapped in the cries of cicadas and the smell of damp earth. But after Anara came, something else settled in, an unease that lived in the rafters, that crept beneath doors, that slid over skin when the lamps went out. People whispered that she moved like someone taught to be invisible, yet every soft footstep echoed louder than it should. The master grew bolder. The mistress grew colder. And Anara, who spoke little, began waking at night with her hands trembling, gripping the sheets as though something unseen stood over her. The first time the master visited her cabin, the moon was low and the sky was bruised purple with clouds. No one spoke of it, but everyone heard the hinge of her door sigh open, slow and guilty. What happened inside stayed locked behind silence, but when Anara emerged the next morning, her gaze was different. Not broken, just older, as if a part of her had stepped into a place she could never return from. Seasons passed. Her belly grew. The master walked taller. The mistress moved like a ghost, silent, watchful, hollowed by something she would not name. And when the baby finally came, born on a storm-torn night, Anara held the child to her chest with a trembling that did not stop even when the wind died. Before dawn, she disappeared into the trees behind the cabins, barefoot and shaking, clutching the newborn against her heart. No one followed. No one dared. She returned just as the sun rose, empty-armed, her nightdress stained with earth, her lips pressed shut as if to keep a terrible secret from escaping. From that morning on, the plantation changed. Shadows moved where nothing should move. The woods grew restless. And Anara, beautiful, silent Anara, walked with the sorrow of a woman carrying the weight of lives the world was never meant to see. The arrival at the plantation marked the beginning of a quiet disturbance that would eventually ripple through every corner of the estate. When Anara stepped off the wagon, the workers paused in their labor, their eyes drawn to her with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She carried herself with an unusual stillness, as if she had learned long ago that being too noticeable could be dangerous, yet her presence demanded attention. Her features were soft but striking, her gaze steady in a way that made people shift uncomfortably. Even the air seemed to thicken around her, as though the land itself recognized that something had shifted. She didn't speak as she was led toward the main house, but her silence wasn't the silence of fear, it was deeper, as if it held something she refused to let out. The master watched her with a strange intensity the moment she arrived, his eyes following her with interest that felt too sharp, too assessing. The mistress stood a few steps behind him, her fingertips resting on the porch railing, her face calm but her jaw tight. She saw what her husband saw, and beneath her composed expression something cold began to coil. The workers exchanged glances, understanding the unspoken tension long before anyone dared voice it. They had seen this pattern before, a new girl brought in, the master's gaze lingering, the mistress's silence sharpening. But Anara was different. She didn't carry fear like the others had. She carried something quieter, something like resignation mixed with an unreadable awareness. As she was taken past the cabins, the older women whispered small blessings under their breath, sensing that she might need them. The children stared openly, captivated by her beauty but unsettled by the stillness in her eyes. That night, as she was shown to the small room that would now be hers, she stood by the window and looked out into the dark field, the breeze lifting the loose strands of her hair. She didn't tremble, didn't cry, didn't cling to anything familiar. Instead, she breathed in deeply, as if preparing herself for something she already knew she couldn't escape. The estate held its breath with her, sensing the tension forming in quiet corners, sensing the inevitable shift that would follow her arrival. Even the cicadas seemed to lower their chorus as she settled into the room, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The moment she lay down on the narrow bed, a storm began building far off in the distance, the faint rumble of thunder rolling across the land like a warning carried through the night. The master's obsession began almost imperceptibly, woven into the small moments he allowed himself to linger near Anara. At first, it was simply the way his gaze followed her as she carried out the chores assigned to her, his eyes drifting toward her even when he pretended to be focused on paperwork or conversation. He would stand in doorways longer than necessary, watching her sweep the halls or fetch water from the well, his attention fixed with a fascination he didn't bother to hide. The workers noticed it before Anara did, exchanging uneasy looks whenever he appeared unexpectedly in places he rarely visited. His footsteps grew more frequent around the servants' quarters, and the sound of his voice softened when he addressed her, a tone reserved for no one else on the estate. Anara kept her head lowered, answering him respectfully, yet something in her posture shifted when he approached. She became more still, her movements measured, as if she sensed what was building long before he found the courage to act on it. The mistress noticed too, though she said nothing. She watched her husband with a quiet, simmering resentment, her forced smiles sharper, her glances colder. The tension in the main house grew thicker each day, hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that had not yet been lit but was already consuming the walls. The master began inventing reasons to summon Anara, asking her to polish artifacts in his study or bring fresh water to rooms that were already well stocked. He praised her work excessively, his voice dipping into a softness that seemed entirely out of place in a man known for his severity. The other enslaved workers tried to subtly shield her, offering to take on tasks meant for her, stepping between her and the master whenever possible, but there were limits to their reach. Power moved around him like a shadow he controlled effortlessly, and each day it crept closer to her. One evening, long after the sun had sunk behind the trees, the master found her sweeping the porch. He stood too close, the lantern light casting their shadows onto the wooden boards, merging them as though the night itself had decided what would happen. His voice, low and deliberate, broke the quiet as he asked questions that had nothing to do with her work, questions meant to draw out parts of her she kept hidden. She answered sparingly, her tone polite but distant, a boundary he pretended not to notice. From that night forward, his presence followed her everywhere, a constant weight she could neither push away nor outrun. The plantation seemed to grow smaller under the gravity of his obsession, each path narrowing until it became clear that sooner or later, he would step across the final line she prayed he would leave untouched. The mistress's silent rage began long before anyone realized it had taken root, simmering beneath her composed exterior like coals hidden under ash. She had always been a woman of restraint, someone who believed dignity was maintained through silence rather than outbursts, but the moment she noticed the way her husband's eyes trailed after Anara, something inside her hardened. It wasn't the first time she had witnessed his wandering interest, yet this time felt different, heavier, as though a line had been crossed that could never be redrawn. She studied Anara with the cold precision of someone inspecting a threat, her gaze drifting over the girl's delicate features, her calm manner, the unsettling quiet that seemed to cling to her. The household sensed the shift before they understood it. The mistress no longer offered soft greetings or polite acknowledgments. Instead, she moved through the halls like a shadow sharpened by bitterness. Her footsteps grew quieter, her expressions more unreadable, and when she passed Anara, her eyes lingered not with open hostility but with something far more dangerous, calculation. She said nothing, but silence can be far more revealing than words. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, that settled into corners and warned everyone who felt it that a storm was forming behind her composed facade. Anara, with her keen instinct for danger, noticed the change almost immediately. She lowered her gaze whenever the mistress approached, not out of fear but out of an understanding that meeting her eyes might invite consequences she wasn't prepared to face. The mistress watched her closely, observing every movement, every lowered eyelash, every breath that seemed to carry a quiet defiance. In the dining room, she would glance at the empty chair her husband occasionally left to wander through the halls, and her jaw would tighten in a way she tried to hide. When the master called for Anara to assist him in the study, the mistress simply paused, her hand tightening around a silver goblet until her knuckles blanched. She said nothing, but her stare followed them, burning with questions she already knew the answers to. She waited in the hallway afterward, pretending to arrange flowers, but her presence was deliberate. Each time Anara emerged from a room the master had occupied, the mistress's eyes flicked to her with a quiet fury that forced the girl's steps to quicken. At night, lying beside the husband who had grown increasingly distant, the mistress stared at the ceiling, her mind weaving possibilities in the dark. She didn't confront him, didn't scream, didn't demand explanations. Instead, she lay in silence, letting the resentment rise and settle, until it transformed into something colder and far more focused, a quiet promise that she would not be the one to break, she would be the one to watch everything else fall apart instead. Anara's first pregnancy unfolded in whispers long before anyone dared to speak the truth aloud. It began with the small signs, the way she paused to steady herself after standing too quickly, the way her hand drifted to her abdomen when she thought no one was watching, the quiet fatigue that softened her already gentle steps. The other enslaved women noticed first, exchanging glances heavy with pity and dread. They had seen this happen before, had watched the master's desires ripple through the quarters like a curse no one could outrun. Yet with Anara, it felt different. There was an eerie stillness about her, as if she had expected this outcome from the very night the master's shadow first crossed her doorway. The master seemed almost proud, a dangerous gleam settling into his eyes whenever Anara passed by. He walked with more confidence, spoke with an unearned satisfaction, as though the life growing inside her elevated his power even further. He never acknowledged the child openly, but his presence around her grew bolder, more frequent. He found excuses to summon her, to inquire after her health in tones far too gentle for a man accustomed to commanding with cruelty. His interest was unmistakable, and it wrapped around Anara like a net she could not escape. The mistress, meanwhile, moved through the house with a quiet fury sharpened into something nearly invisible. She watched Anara's growing belly with a gaze cold enough to freeze air. She never spoke a word about it, but the silence she carried through the halls became more suffocating than any accusation she could have voiced. Every time the master left the room when Anara entered, every time he lingered too long, every time his voice softened in her presence, the mistress swallowed another shard of her own anger. The pieces accumulated inside her until her stillness became more dangerous than any outburst could have been. The workers felt the tension pressing down on them like humidity before a storm. The estate grew quiet in new ways, as if the walls themselves were watching, listening. Anara tried to keep to herself, completing her tasks with a calm that seemed almost unnatural. But beneath that calm lived a deep, private fear, one that flickered in her eyes at night, when she lay awake listening to the rustle of leaves outside her window, wondering what fate awaited the child she carried. She moved through her days as though suspended between worlds, her body heavy with life while her spirit drifted somewhere distant. And though no one dared speak it aloud, everyone on the plantation felt the shift. Her pregnancy was not just a secret growing in her body, it was a spark buried in dry grass, and the wind was already beginning to rise. The night of the first birth arrived with a violence that seemed almost intentional, as if the sky itself understood what was coming and chose to cloak it in thunder and darkness. Rain hammered the roof of Anara's small cabin, the wind pressing against the walls with a restless urgency. Inside, Anara labored alone, her breath quick and shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the cot as each wave of pain surged through her. No midwife had been sent, no woman allowed to stand by her side, for the mistress had quietly ensured that help would arrive too late, and the master was nowhere to be found. The storm swallowed her cries, leaving only the muffled sounds of her struggle drifting into the night like a plea swallowed by the wind. The birth happened in a brief, fragile moment between lightning strikes, when the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The child's first cry pierced the air, thin and trembling, mixing with the storm's fury. Anara held the baby close to her chest, her hands shaking as she tried to quiet the tiny, frightened wail. For a moment, she allowed herself to look into the newborn's face, searching for something, comfort, promise, maybe even a hint of innocence untouched by the sins that had created it. Instead, what she felt was a chilling heaviness, a weight that pressed against her heart with a force she didn't understand. It wasn't the child's fault, that truth pulsed painfully through her. Yet when she touched the baby's cheek, she felt the world shift around her in a way she couldn't explain. The room seemed colder, the shadows deeper. The storm outside roared louder as if protesting the child's existence or warning her of something she had not yet fully grasped. She thought she heard something beneath the child's cry, a faint echo that didn't belong to an infant, a whisper that brushed against her ear like breath from an unseen presence. It sent a shiver down her spine so sharp she had to shut her eyes. As the minutes passed, the fear inside her grew, tightening around her like a hand closing slowly on her throat. She rocked the child gently, murmuring broken words meant to soothe both of them, but the whisper lingered, weaving itself into her thoughts. She could not shake the feeling that the child nursed a sorrow older than its first hour on earth, a sorrow that had no place in the fragile body she held. The storm raged on, but Anara heard nothing except the echoing weight inside her mind, something ancient and mournful that wrapped itself around her and the newborn in a way that made her realize, with a tremor of terror, that nothing about this birth was ordinary, and nothing that followed would ever be touched by peace again. Before the first light of dawn crept across the plantation, Anara rose from her cot with the newborn held tightly against her chest. The storm had quieted into a steady drizzle, the world outside washed in the faint, colorless glow of early morning. Her night dress clung to her skin, heavy with sweat and rain, but her movements were steady, deliberate, as though she had made this decision long before the child ever took its first breath. She stepped out into the cool air, her bare feet sinking into the wet earth, the silence around her broken only by the distant rumble of retreating thunder. No one saw her leave. No one dared be awake at such an hour, not after the storm's violence. She walked toward the woods behind the cabins, the place where the trees grew so thick that dawn struggled to penetrate. The branches hung low with rainwater, brushing against her as she passed, as if trying to hold her back or mourn the choice already set in motion. The newborn stirred weakly, its small cry almost swallowed by the damp air. Anara paused, her breath trembling, but her arms did not loosen. Something in her eyes, fear, desperation, or perhaps a grim clarity, pushed her forward into the shadows. Deep inside the woods, she found a patch of soft ground, the earth loosened by the night's storm. She knelt slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion and an ache that reached far beyond physical pain. Her hands dug into the soil, pulling it aside with trembling fingers. Mud smeared her arms, clung beneath her nails, soaked into her dress, but she did not stop. She dug until the hole yawned before her, small and deep enough for what she carried. The child whimpered again, a thin, fragile sound that sliced through her resolve. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, torn between the instinct to protect and the terror still echoing from the moment she first heard that unnatural whisper in the cabin. She lowered her head, pressing her forehead to the baby's, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She murmured something too soft for the world to hear, a desperate apology or a blessing meant to shield the infant from whatever curse had touched it at birth. When she returned to the cabin as the sun began to rise, her arms were empty, her nightdress smeared with earth, her breathing unsteady but quiet. She slipped inside unnoticed, her face pale and hollow, her eyes avoiding the curious stares that flickered at her from neighboring doorways. No one questioned her. They could see the truth without words, the weight of soil on her skin, the haunted stillness in her gaze. And though no one followed her into the woods that morning, everyone felt something settle over the plantation, a heaviness that whispered of secrets buried before the world could name them. A quiet pattern began to unfold in the months that followed, a rhythm so unnatural that even the wind seemed to change whenever Anara's belly began to swell again. It started with the same signs as before, her movements slowing, the faint exhaustion in her eyes, the instinctive way her hand settled on her abdomen when she thought no one was looking. The women in the quarters exchanged looks of dread because they already knew what this meant. They had watched her walk into the woods before dawn carrying a child and return alone, her dress stained with soil and sorrow. They had kept her secret not out of approval but out of fear, because whatever compelled her to bury that first baby felt like something woven too deeply into the shadows to be spoken aloud. The master, blinded by pride and desire, never questioned the absence of the infant. He simply basked in the knowledge that Anara had borne his blood, his attention toward her intensifying with each passing day. He visited her more openly now, his footsteps on the wooden floors predictable in their trespass. The mistress knew too. The tension around her had grown so thick it was almost visible in the air. She watched Anara's second pregnancy with a chilling silence, her expression frozen in that dangerous middle ground between fury and calculation. When the second birth approached, there was no storm, no violent rain, yet the night felt just as heavy. Anara labored quietly, her breath shallow, her face pale with something more than physical pain. The baby came in the stillness of midnight, crying softly into her trembling hands. For a fleeting moment, she held the infant close, her heart aching with a tenderness she had once believed lost. But then came that same coldness, that same whisper hidden beneath the child's breath, so faint she could have convinced herself it was nothing if not for the memory of the first night. The sound froze her blood, filling her with the same terror that had driven her through the storm months before. By dawn, she walked toward the woods again, her steps slow, her body weak, her eyes rimmed with sleepless dread. The workers watched from their cabins, their expressions heavy with helplessness. They knew what she carried. They knew where she was going. No one followed her, though a few whispered prayers into their hands, hoping the trees might show her mercy. When she returned, empty-armed again, the pattern became undeniable. Another child born. Another child buried. Another morning where she moved like a ghost through the quarters, carrying not just grief but a fear that lived behind her eyes like a shadow she could not escape. And with each quiet burial, the plantation grew more restless. The woods whispered at night. The air chilled without reason. Something unspoken was spreading, and everyone felt it, even if no one dared name what it was. The master's suspicion grew slowly, creeping into his thoughts the way rot creeps into wood, quiet, invisible at first, but spreading with a persistence he couldn't ignore. At the beginning, he had been content to believe whatever lie soothed his pride. The disappearance of the first newborn barely registered in his mind. He convinced himself the child had been taken away by the mistress to be handled discreetly, a hidden arrangement to protect his reputation. But when Anara's second pregnancy came and went with no baby to show, a sharp unease began to settle into him. He noticed small details he had once overlooked, the way Anara avoided his gaze when her belly grew heavy, the way the other workers fell silent whenever he entered a room, the way the woods behind the quarters seemed disturbed as though recently walked by trembling feet carrying something fragile and forbidden. His discomfort sharpened the night he heard whispers among the workers, words cut short the moment he stepped closer. Their silence was too heavy, their eyes too nervous. One of the younger men refused to meet his gaze at all, his hands shaking as he worked. The master's pride flared with indignation, but beneath it was something colder, something he had not felt before. A fear that he had lost control, that something on his land was unfolding outside his power. He began paying closer attention to Anara, watching her with an intensity that shifted from desire to scrutiny. He noticed the way she flinched when he touched her shoulder, the exhaustion beneath her silence, the haunted glaze that clouded her eyes during the late months of pregnancy. And then there were the nights, those unsettling nights when he heard faint noises coming from the woods. Not animals, not wind, but something else entirely. Once, he thought he heard the soft, muffled cry of a baby carried on the damp air before it faded into the trees. He stood at the edge of the porch for several minutes, listening, his pulse tightening in his throat. When the sound didn't return, he told himself it had been a trick of the night, but the doubt never left him. By the time Anara's third pregnancy reached its final weeks, suspicion had consumed him. He began asking questions, thinly veiled under concern. Where had the children gone? Why had he never seen them? Why had no one heard them after the day they were born? But his questions drifted into silence, for no one dared answer. The mistress watched him unravel with a quiet satisfaction, while Anara moved through the days with a fear so carefully concealed that it became almost invisible. The master found himself pacing the halls at night, trembling with the knowledge that something deeply wrong was happening under his own roof, yet terrified to confront it. His suspicion was no longer whispering at him, it was screaming, but the truth remained just out of reach, buried in the woods behind the quarters where only Anara dared to tread, carrying secrets he feared he no longer had the power to uncover. The estate's unease deepened when strange noises began slipping out of the woods at night, sounds so faint and fleeting that many workers tried to convince themselves they had imagined them. But the whispers persisted, soft rustles where there should have been stillness, faint cries that echoed like memories rather than living voices, and the unsettling sensation that something moved beneath the soil itself. The woods had always been a place people avoided after dark, but now even passing by during the day felt wrong. The air hung heavy with a chill that didn't belong to the season, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than the trees themselves. One evening, as the sun sank and the sky turned copper, a young worker named Eli ventured into the woods searching for fallen branches to use as firewood. He stayed close to the edge at first, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone or something to follow him. The ground was damp beneath his feet, the leaves slick from a recent rain. He moved quickly, gathering what he needed, eager to return before nightfall swallowed the last traces of light. But a faint sound stopped him, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers brushing against wood from beneath the ground. At first he froze, thinking it was his imagination, but then it came again, a fragile echo rising from the earth itself. Drawn by a mixture of dread and curiosity, Eli stepped deeper between the trees. The tapping grew more insistent, almost pleading. He followed the sound to a patch of disturbed soil, a place where the earth had been turned recently. The pattern was unmistakable, someone had dug here, and not long ago. His heart pounded as he knelt, reaching out to touch the loose dirt. The moment his fingertips brushed the ground, an icy shiver shot up his spine, and the noise abruptly stopped, replaced by a thick, unnatural silence. The stillness felt alive, pressing against him like a warning. Eli stumbled back, breath catching in his throat. The air felt heavier now, suffocating. He tried to tell himself it was just settling earth, nothing more, but deep down he knew the truth he didn't want to speak. Those were no animal sounds, no natural shifts. Something buried in that soil had been trying to be heard. He fled the woods, dropping his bundle of branches along the way, not daring to look back even when the bushes behind him rustled as though something unseen had risen to watch him leave. When he reached the cabins, pale and trembling, the others knew without asking what he had encountered. They had felt it too, the presence growing stronger, the silence thickening around the graves Anara had dug. No one spoke of it openly, but a quiet terror wound itself through the quarters, for whatever lay buried in those woods had not finished whispering, and the earth no longer seemed content to keep their secrets hidden. As Anara approached her final pregnancy, the weight of everything she had carried before pressed against her chest like stone. Each step she took across the plantation felt heavier, the air thick with a tension that made the birds fall silent and the wind linger in uneasy currents. She knew that this time, there would be no margin for error, no refuge in the shadows of early morning. Every memory of the children she had buried, their tiny bodies pressed into cold earth, the faint, haunting cries she had once thought she could ignore rose to meet her, and with them came an understanding she had tried to keep buried. The land itself remembered, and it demanded reckoning. The master, now restless and impatient, prowled the house with an intensity that bordered on madness. He had watched the signs in Anara's body, the subtle swells and shifts, and his suspicion had grown too heavy to ignore. He questioned the workers with thinly veiled threats, though none dared betray her secret. The mistress, silent and calculating as always, followed every movement with cold attention, her eyes like a blade poised to cut, measuring each second, each breath, as though waiting for the moment the fragile balance of power would snap. The household trembled under these unspoken pressures, the air charged with a quiet electricity that made every step sound louder than it should, every glance more dangerous. Inside her small cabin, Anara felt the life within her pressing, stretching her mind as much as her body. The whispers she had heard at the births of her previous children returned, sharper and more urgent now, threading through her thoughts like cold fingers. She sensed that forces beyond her understanding were gathering, that the woods behind the quarters, the disturbed soil, and the earth itself were watching, waiting, reminding her that the choices she had made had consequences far beyond the moment of a child's first cry. The baby she carried now was different, she could feel it, a quiet, insistent presence unlike any she had known. It demanded more than secrecy, it demanded the acknowledgement of the truth she had hidden for so long. As the days shortened and the air grew chillier, signs began appearing around the plantation, broken twigs where no one had walked, soft impressions in the damp earth, faint shadows that slipped between trees even in full daylight. The workers whispered prayers, yet even they felt powerless against the unfolding inevitability. Anara moved through it all with a careful, measured calm, her expression unreadable, though her hands trembled beneath the folds of her dress. Every night, as she lay awake listening to the wind rustle through the trees, she felt the culmination of years of sorrow, fear, and quiet determination pressing closer, pressing toward a revelation she could no longer avoid, a truth the world outside her cabin had been inching toward without ever realizing it.